Okay, welcome everyone to today's class of Screen Cultures, a class which in some ways will serve as the capstone of a series of classes in which we've been discussing dominant configurations and then more recent reconfigurations of masculinity in popular film and television, while at the same time taking up the strand of queer representation. We started the course by introducing ways in which we might understand or unpack representations of queerness, and also ways in which queer readers, queer spectators could read texts differently from non-queer spectators. And especially in our last class on Brokeback Mountain, we returned to queer representation and coupled it with an analysis of changing representations of masculinity, which we traced back to the Western as one specific genre that it tends to and gives the viewer a representation of dominant hegemonic masculinity. But as we argued, by the end of the Western that we analyzed, John Ford's The Searchers, we begin to see a crack in the facade and a potential move away from traditional dominant modes of masculinity to masculinities and new models of masculinity that move away from and no longer endorse some of the quote unquote toxic elements of masculinity that we saw represented in the character of Ethan Edwards. That was my best attempt in a minute to sort of provide you with a through line of this set of classes that have formed in many ways a unit within our broader analysis of representations of race, gender, and sexuality in popular film and television. And that is exactly what we will be doing in today's class, in which we will unpack the ways in which Black masculinity, and specifically a queer or potentially queer, and this is something that we'll discuss, masculinity is represented in Black Mirror's fifth season opener, Striking Vipers, and we will do so by performing a deep dive in Snorton's analysis of the down low and men who are on the down low and on the DL. This is one of my favorite readings of the semester. Continually, whenever I revisit this text, just astounded by the depth and the complexity and the nuance that Snorton brings to that discussion. And I hope that some of you were able to identify ways in which it builds on exactly those discussions that we've been having since the start of the semester. The use of specularity, of the scopic, of the gaze, all of this, where we started the class, is one of the building blocks in Snorton's framework as well. But before we get ahead of our skis, I wanted to quickly begin by gauging some of the popular responses to this episode, so to the fifth season opener. Black Mirror has quickly become one of the most popular television shows, and the beginning of every single season, and especially the season opener, has performed the role of cultural water cooler moment. Whenever a new season of Black Mirror premieres, there's usually one or two episodes that garner a lot of attention, and the premiere episode specifically of a season has performed that role. And that was certainly true for Striking Vipers as well. There were a number of responses to this episode, and they really ran the gamut. So I quickly wanted to just pull up a number of those responses, a number of ways in which this episode was received. Here's one. This is from The Guardian, so The Guardian's analysis, headlining Queer Fears, the Problem with Black Mirror's No Homo Episode. Guy Lodgier arguing that there's a frustratingly regressive tone to an episode about two men exploring their masculinity that feels embarrassed and coy about its subject matter. What do you make of this analysis of this episode on the one hand, and secondly, how does this specific analysis, this specific response, illustrate a number of dominant articulations, or rather, how does it illustrate what has been the dominant reception of the DL writ large? In other words, how can we bring some of Snorton's critique and re-articulation of the DL to bear on this specific response to the episode? In many ways, the ways in which Lodge here formulates his response is indicative of some of those ways in which the DL has been broadly understood or misunderstood. So you can take up either part of that question. So what do you make of this, and how can we relate it to Snorton's analysis of the DL? Will, go ahead.
So I kind of had the same initial reaction to Guy Lodge when I first saw this episode, but I feel like after doing the reading, which brought in a lot of the, societal racial elements to the DL, I think it's kind of hard as a white queer viewer to comment on, the dynamics at work here, because again, I don't fully understand through personal experience how racial elements, other than my own whiteness, would influence queerness or sexuality. So I think, when you incorporate, sorry, the name of the author is slipping me, but when you incorporate their piece and like the deep dive they do into the racial dynamics, it kind of, it makes the episode a little bit more fair.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And you're exactly right. So Snorton takes pains to point out, in many ways, queer white criticism fails to understand the phenomenon or the practice of the DL, because historically, and this is something we've talked about when we've talked specifically about feminist theory and the lacunae in feminist theory, queer criticism, queer theory has failed to pay attention to the ways in which race and the configuration, or we could say the intersection. I'm surprised that at no point in this article Snorton uses the term intersectional or intersectionality, but what he's describing is very much an intersectional phenomenon, and specifically the failures of dominant white queer theory to deploy an intersectional lens, which is required to understand the phenomenon of the DL. So I hope that was one of the clear takeaways that you had from Snorton's reading. The only way in which we can understand this is if we look specifically at the intersection of Black masculinity and sexuality. And that is very much lacking from this article, right? Or at least from this headline, right? There's a frustratingly regressive tone to an episode about two men. Yes, but it isn't just an episode about two men, it's an episode about two Black men, and that's crucial. So this omission is telling and explains why Lodge, as a white critic, would project a specific expectation of queerness onto a show and onto characters and onto a world that he doesn't fully understand. And again, that omission of Black here is critical, because in many ways Snorton argues that this is an omission that is quite telling and that has productively shaped queer theory, just not for the better. Claudia?
Yeah, I actually read this article after rewatching the episode, and I thought it was interesting that it brought up San Junipero, which is the episode from season 3. And I don't know if we're going to be talking about it in class, like as a comparison, but I just thought it was interesting how it kind of, how he kind of like said San Junipero was this like perfect episode, and then kind of juxtaposed Striking Vipers as like a horrible episode. Not that I also think San Junipero is a perfect episode, but I thought it was strange how he felt the need to, rank them as two queer love stories.
Yes, you're exactly right. And that's a great point. That's a great point, Claudia. So in many ways, what he does is that he turns striking vipers into the other of San Junipero. In other words, San Junipero becomes the self, becomes the ideal representation, whereas this show becomes the other. And that is exactly the dynamic of othering that has been at work in ways in which dominant culture writ large, i.e. white culture, has approached the DL and men who are on the DL, and then representations of them. Romy?
The title here and the concept of like no homo kind of implies that these two men are secretly gay and living false double lives, which Snorton took pains to point out that men who have sex with other men or any of these terms, they don't properly identify what the like sexual identity of men on the DL is, because it's more complicated than secretly being gay and hiding that. There's more to it.
Yes, and that is another crucial point. And this is another example of the ways in which words matter, and naming, classifying, classifications, ordering has profound implications for how we understand, in this case, sexuality. So for Lodge, the DL is not a stable classification. And Snorton talks about the instability, and we'll talk about that as well, that is inherent in the DL as a phenomenon. But because it is an unstable categorization, because it is internally incoherent, illegible, contradictory at times, it becomes difficult. And if you're working with a framework of terms that are legible, that are comprehensible, and you try to project them onto this text, you're going to run into a problem. And the experience for you might be unsatisfactory because it fails to live up to, it fails to work with the terms and understandings that you bring to the text as a white critic. Will?
I just have a question. So like there are several different conceptualizations of sexuality. You know, one of them that's kind of more predominant and more popular these days, that sexuality is a spectrum. So why do all these critics and why do most academics feel a need to like categorize the DL as something rather than just accepting it as some kind of nebulous spot on a sexuality spectrum?
That's a good question. How does Snorton begin to answer it? Let me rephrase. Does Snorton feel the need to do that? Is the point of Snorton's article a stabilization or the enshrining or rather the inauguration of a new category that one can identify and pinpoint on the spectrum? Is that what you think he sets out to do or ends up doing in the article? Or does he, as you put it, Will, leave it nebulous, leave it undefined? What did you think? Will?
I mean, there was one line that stood out to me when he was like referring to it as like the glass closet.
Yes.
And he kind of goes on with his metaphor. He says glass is brittle yet indefinitely malleable. It is transparent, chemically inert, and durable. So I think, I suppose his answer there is that yes, it is nebulous and fluid. Like it can be whatever the, not, I don't want to say subject of it, but whoever the person, you know, living that life wants it to be.
Yes, and that central metaphor or sign, and it's a compound sign and it's a complex configuration of the glass closet, is one that we'll unpack in some detail as soon as we transition to a discussion of the article itself. But I would agree with you that ultimately Snorton leaves a great deal of room for exactly that ambivalence, for exactly those contradictory impulses that are captured not just in this notion of the glass closet, but in the concept of glass itself. And that's why Snorton finds glass and just the physical characteristics of glass such a powerful sign for speaking to the phenomenon of the DL and men who are on the DL. Let's move on to some of the other responses, and these two I've combined onto a single slide here. So we have a response on the left. Black Mirror Striking Vipers is an important exploration of Black masculinity and sexuality. And then on the right, Black Mirror Striking Vipers raises some interesting dynamics, but falls short when depicting Black male intimacy. What do you make of these quick takes or these headlines? Is there one that you found yourself agreeing with after watching the episode and doing the reading? You more prone to sign on to or endorse either of these responses? Caroline?
I would initially go to endorse the one on the left about being an important exploration of Black masculinity and sexuality, just because Snorton talks a lot in the article about this dichotomy of like Black women being the unknowing victims and then Black men being like the liars and the cheaters. And I think that this episode offered kind of a different gaze into that relationship, just because of how the relationship of the marriage developed throughout the episode. I've never seen it before, but when I saw it for the first time this morning, just the character of the wife was also like a crucial element in this story. And I think that it is an important exploration of Black masculinity and sexuality, because it's honestly like kind of ambiguous. Like it doesn't, like Will was saying, it doesn't really categorize itself within the framework. It's not like a no homo storyline, but it's also not like a 100% queer storyline.
Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. I think you've done a beautiful job of explaining how this episode itself, on the part of the spectator, can lead to ambivalence and can lead to contradictory responses. And you, as a spectator, might feel that you're pulled in a number of different directions. And Snorton would find that productive. Eliza?
I agree with Caroline on the left one. And I thought the right one was kind of interesting because when I saw it, I was like, okay, there's about like 10 minutes left. I wonder what's going to like happen with them. Mm-hmm. And I think I kind of do agree that it falls short when depicting the Black male intimacy, because like you get like, okay, his wife understands, I guess, a little bit, but I feel like the characters you don't really think come to terms with that, because they're comfortable with it being in the game. But even like after the kiss, it's still like you kind of see that conversation, for at least I felt like Anthony Mackie's character was still kind of like wasn't really unpacked all the way. I was still kind of like, well, okay, it's over, but did he have feelings about the kiss that he's not explaining? Or like, because I felt like his reaction to his friend saying, oh yeah, I felt nothing, was kind of like, oh yeah, me too, but he kind of did in a weird way.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and what you're pointing to here is the silences that exist in the text. And Snorton spends some time talking about the critical potential of silences and silencing. And you're right, especially in the last act, if you will, of the episode, silence plays a structurally important role. There's a number of ways in which conversations that we might want to be privy to, I'm thinking specifically of one of the most profound silences, which is where in the car ride home from the police station, we see Danny open his mouth and then we cut to the future. So we have a silence that punctuates or that takes the place of a conversation between Theo and Danny that contains a great deal of information, but we're not privy to that information. That's replaced by a silence. And the question will be, what work does that silence perform? What is the role of that act of strategic silencing by the text? It's a great point. Let's see here, Tarek.
I kind of disagree with saying like Anthony Mackie's character doesn't show any. Well, I mean, he doesn't outright show any emotions, but like throughout the episode, like when he's sending the text and he has like an X at the end, and we see when the message is sent, like he deleted it, but it like shows like that X, meaning like kisses, was like kind of like his way of showing or being a little bit intimate. And again, in that scene after they were kissing, like his face definitely told more than like what he said. And I feel like this comes back to in the Snorton reading, there was a mention of a kind of like unembraceable like stoicism about Black masculinity, where it's not really, or they're not really depicted as being outright with their feelings. So you have to look for like the small things in their actions. And I think there was enough small things to kind of indicate that he did have feelings for Carl.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much for that excellent contribution, Tarek. And I love how you bring in the scene of Danny behind his desk going back and forth on the X and whether to include the X in that text message or not, because that's an extremely potent scene, and one that also points again to the powerful role played by technology, which is also something that Snorton analyzes. So here we have another medium, in this case his cell phone and text messaging, as a way in which, the actor, the user, can frame or express his identity in a specific way, in the same way that the game that they play allows for that unique expression as well. And it also reminds me of the discussion that we had when we talked about Brokeback Mountain, where, if you'll recall, Keller and Jones, although they're critical of the text's queer potential, credit the text for expanding what male intimacy can mean. So they credit Brokeback Mountain for giving us a representation of male intimacy, just not queer male intimacy. And many critics have approached Black Mirror in the same way. In other words, as an exploration of what we've called homosociality. So not homosexuality, but homosociality. So an intimacy that can exist between straight identifying men. And that in and of itself is a powerful answer to exactly what you've described, which is the fact that dominant representations and understandings of Black masculinity writ large do not allow for that expression of intimacy. Emma?
Oh, sorry. I was kind of gonna say like a similar thing to Tarek. I somewhat disagreed with what Eliza was saying about how it like almost reinforces that the scene fell short of depicting Black male intimacy. I kind of think it does the opposite and somewhat supports the article we read, because it kind of leaves that sense of ambiguity with their sexuality, which really emphasizes like the true concept of the down low, because it is like an ambiguous category. Whereas if they had both expressed like direct feelings of like, oh yeah, this is great after the kiss, and had kind of fallen into a directly gay category, it would have kind of negated the down low's point of like, they're not necessarily gay or they're not necessarily straight, but they can have like a variance in their identity. So I think it kind of negates like that, the right article's title, because I think it does like depict a different view of Black male intimacy.
Absolutely. Thank you for that, for sharing your reading of that scene. Tarek? Unless you just forgot to put your hand down.
Oh, sorry. I forgot.
I thought maybe he has something to add. Will?
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to react to both, I guess. Like the only part of the episode that I drew issue with, and again, I'm saying this as a white viewer, was that I feel like based off the reading and based off of like how I saw, the two characters' relationship in the flash forward 7 years later, like this whole concept of at least the down low, or at least the idea that his name's Danny, that Danny stays married to his wife, whereas Carl is just kind of like the single, lonely, depressed bachelor. I don't know. It just kind of seems like they're still playing into oppressive. Like the down low was born of oppressive societal, concepts of masculinity, and I can understand the idea that, like, I understand the role of the avatars, that like that like by changing race they were kind of getting away from like those like structures of Black masculinity. But the only thing, again, I drew issue with, and where I think the episode does shy away, is that like in real life, when someone's on the down low, like they're still fully having sex with a male body. It's not, a male mind and a female avatar, which I think kind of is at least part of the reason why I think it shies away and doesn't fully embrace it. Because I feel like if it actually showed, Black male intimacy in the same way that Moonlight did, or, other, I guess, I'm not sure, this is sound awful, I'm not sure if there are other works that do that, but I feel like it would have been a more positive embrace and discussion of it, if that makes sense, and a little bit more progressive.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. You are right to point out that one of the central questions, which appears throughout the general broad response to the episode, is of course exactly the question of heterosexual sex versus same-sex sexual practices, which are absent from the episode. And this, of course, is one of the questions that we will be wrestling with. As well. Does the use of technology, does this in-game universe and the use of straight presenting avatars and their sexual actions somehow preclude or stand in the way of or preempt an actual quote-unquote homosexual same-sex sexual act? Or do we still have that act? And there are some critics who argue that this is still a representation of it. It's just mediated because the pleasure, again, is felt by both of these men. So there is this connective tissue of pleasure that links them in this sexual act, but it is mediated by and through these avatars. And these avatars are not just gendered differently, they're also racialized differently. And that's something that we will definitely get into later in the discussion. Marcel?
Yeah, I just wanted to go off what Will said and what you just said about pleasure, because I felt like that was the primary reason for the relation taking place between these two men. Tariq brought up before, like the text message with the ex, and like I thought that was a really good point, because it's not something that I've noticed it in the episode, but I didn't think of that being like quote unquote like gay of Danny to do. But then the fact that he did it over the phone, and like all their interactions are primarily over technology except for the beginning, the dinner, and the very end. And during those scenes, if you look specifically for like some sort of gaze, which I know that the author of the piece that we were talking about said that sometimes a gaze between two Black men can be telling, or it's used to like tell that there is something deeper. I thought there was like a lack of that gaze. Actually, I thought it was very friendly, their relationship. It didn't seem romantic. So what you said about like how seeking pleasure, like when Carl goes to dinner, he's talking about like how good the sex is, how he's tried to recreate it and how it doesn't work, and how he's had sex with other women, other men, people of different races, but that it's just specifically the sex with Danny that's better than anything else. So that's what makes me hesitant to like call either of them completely gay, or like maybe that's where I think if it doesn't fall short, but I don't know. I agree that it's an exploration of Black masculinity and sexuality, but I would hesitate to call it like a homosexual representation.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Marcel, for sharing that as well. And of course, one thing that I think we should stipulate before we move on is that intimacy need not require sexual acts. So intimacy, of course, can take a number of different forms. And you could argue that there are moments of clear intimacy between these two men when we first meet them, when they first play Striking Vipers, or that outdated version of Striking Vipers, when we're in that prolonged flashback. You could argue that just them sitting on the couch together, play fighting with each other as they're actually fighting the game, at one point rolling onto one another. Clearly, there is a comfort level there that exists between these two men that you could argue is already a revolutionary and potentially subversive representation of Black male intimacy, especially if you juxtapose it against the dearth of those representations writ large across dominant representations of Black masculinity, which is what Snorton argues as well. We then have this take, again, another take. The episode itself was fertile ground for a number of different takes, and we've already explored some of them in our own discussion. This critic argues in Nylon magazine, the Black Mirror episode Striking Vipers questions heterosexuality in the best way. It questions heterosexuality. How does it do that? Does anyone agree that this becomes a critique of heterosexuality in many ways? Caroline?
Well, something that I've been thinking about since Marcel brought up the point that she did was that this episode is kind of unique to other displays of like heterosexuality and homosexuality that are typically displayed in film and in TV, because it does exist in this sphere where you can change your identity. And so like we've been talking about, like on this screen, it is heterosexual sex. It is, you know, a female game character and a male game character, and the sex, like the biology of it is heterosexual. But the people behind those characters are not heterosexual. And so like it is like heterosexual sex, but if you look, it's like there's like a curtain. If you look behind that heterosexual sex, there is a lot of queerness to it. So that's just what I was thinking about it.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a great point. And you could even argue that simply the fact that these men, and specifically that one of these men, in this case Carl, is choosing a female avatar and talks quite excitedly, more than excitedly, about how the sensation of being the female partner in that sexual act is completely different. And I would argue that he finds it vastly more pleasurable than if he had been the male partner, is in and of itself queer. I mean, there couldn't be a better sort of illustration of queering and of the potential of queerness than Carl's sort of articulation of the complexity of that pleasure when he is in fact in the skin of, and that's the term used in gaming, right? These characters have skins, so it's the skin that you're in as the player of the game, that being in this different skin affords him. And that in and of itself is a queering, at the very least, of sort of gender immutability, the fact that there is this fluidity there, and that there is this acknowledgement of the pleasure afforded by him in and through his virtual embodiment of Roxanne, or is it Roxette? It's one of the two. Tarek?
I agree with everything that's been said, but I also like found it hard to have that as like one of the main takeaways, because every scene, or like every scene with like queer potential is followed by a scene supporting heteronormativity. So for example, the very first scene when they kiss in the game, immediately after we shift to Danny returning to bed with his wife, and the implication is that they have sex. And then the following scene, when the first time we get like Danny and Carl actually have sex in the game, it's interrupted by Danny's son who's saying he's thirsty. So we're getting a reminder of the family, which is like a staple of the patriarchy and heteronormativity. And then after like they go on their like months long affair or whatever, it ends with Danny and Theo having a conversation on their anniversary, and then the next scene we see is like the baby bump of Theo being pregnant. So again, after like this like queer love affair is over, you're going back to like your normal family, and you're going to have a baby, and like you're going to live your normal life. And then again in the scene, when they like come to blows in the rain, they're interrupted by like the police sirens, and that's like an enforcement arm of like the patriarchy. So like every time we get like this hint that something's about to happen, it's almost as if like, you know, back to your regularly scheduled programming and like forget everything you just saw.
Wow, Tarek, I think you've crafted a very convincing argument there, and you've backed it up with close readings of not just one, but of a number of different scenes. You're absolutely right that heterosexuality, and this is of course what Selassie Bowen argues as well, is a powerful backdrop in this episode, and that it interrupts, and I love that notion of heterosexuality interrupting queerness, because usually when we think of representations of queerness, it's queerness that interrupts heteronormativity, right? We talked about the ways in which dominant mass-mediated texts offer us queer moments, queer interruptions in the text. But here, it's the opposite. We have heteronormativity and the demands of heterosexuality intruding on this potentially queer relationship that Carl and Danny have. But I want to push back a little bit, because it's one thing to say that this is a powerful backdrop, which is absolutely true, but it's crucial that we understand how the text represents those interruptions. In other words, is the return to heteronormativity that we see again and again in the text a return to being a father, a return to being a husband, a return to being a provider? How does the text feel about those returns? How is heterosexuality as an institution, and the institutionalized form of heterosexuality is the nuclear family, and monogamy, how are those represented in the text? How does the text feel about heterosexuality? Does it endorse it? The family, the child, the birthday parties where you're grilling meat? Does it feel celebratory about heterosexuality and its demands? Will?
No, it makes it to look incredibly burdensome and tedious. Like if you listen to like the background conversation at the barbecue, it's the most generic thing you could possibly hear, and like you're even bored just like being in that environment. And you kind of see it in Danny's facial expressions, you know, constantly. Like there's always like this faked smile or like feigned happiness. And I think, you know, going back to his child interrupting, you know, one of their hookups, like, again, it shows that like the nuclear family and the patriarchy or heterosexuality is more of a nuisance and a burden here.
Yes. I find a great deal of evidence of that in the text as well. And it shares this in common again with Brokeback Mountain, where the representation of family life was truly bleak. And I would argue that bleak is, at least in my reading, an appropriate adjective. There's just a bleakness and a draining of color. There's just a mutedness to all of those representations of quote unquote family bliss. And this then has this jarring effect, or juxtaposes very powerfully against the in-game environment, which is spectacularly powerful and saturated with color and neon color to, I would argue, heighten or allow the viewer to become aware of the difference that exists between these two worlds, between the heteronormative world that these characters exist in when they're not in the game, and then the potentially queer landscape and queer space that is created in the text, which through its use of color, its use of music, becomes a more appealing place to be than the sort of bleak, muted universe that these characters exist in the quote unquote real world. Romy?
I'm not sure I entirely agree with that reading. I feel like I see a lot of sympathetic portrayals of the family life. When you see him, Danny, interacting with his child, it's very affectionate, and you kind of approve of his parenting. And you also, there's a lot of sympathy for the character of Theo, and you kind of want their family to be protected. You don't, there's no desire to see the family fall apart. If anything, I think the episode is criticizing monogamy, because it has the spectator rooting for two relationships at once. One which is, yes, in hypercolor and very exciting, but somewhat more superficial than the stability and the rooting of the heterosexual relationship. So I think that, especially with the ending where there's like one day a year where he's allowed to interact through the video game, I think that the film is kind of endorsing a queering of monogamy standards in the patriarchy as opposed to heterosexuality.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. I think that's excellently argued, Romy. In my reading, I would separate these people and the investment that we have in these characters from the institution itself. So I would argue that there's an institutional critique of heterosexuality, the nuclear family, and monogamy separate and apart from these characters. In fact, I would go even further. I would argue that Theo is just as much a victim of those institutional pressures as Danny is. So you root for Theo in part because they share a common enemy, a common foe. But it does mean that we have in Theo a potential departure from the dominant ways in which the female partner is usually represented in down low narratives, where she's victimized at the hands of this. At the hands specifically of her male partner, and you could argue that in Striking Vipers that is not the case. In fact, she's given a certain degree of agency by the end of the text as well, so that one day a year doesn't just become a queer moment for her husband, but also becomes a non-monogamous moment for her. But I absolutely agree with your overall reading there, that we're definitely meant to root for this family as well. What I don't think we're meant to root for is discussions about dishwashers and how to fill them, those barbecues, all of these sort of forced elements that come with heterosexual life. And Theo herself says it, right? She talks about the boredom that characterizes that life. Will?
One possible reading that I had of like her desire, I mean, I suppose that my interpretation might strip her of some agency, but at least my interpretation of her desire to have, extramarital relations on this one day, I kind of connected it to her understanding of her husband's role in the down low, and that like I kind of saw it as like a loss, or like as in he's not quite masculine enough for her, and to be entirely for her anymore. Or at least that was just like one way I looked at it, because I don't know, maybe I'm just being too harsh to the female character, but like at least in like sex scenes when he's being dispassionate, or he's just like clearly not into it, or I don't know, like it maybe I'm just stumbling over my own toes here, but I don't know, I thought it had to do with like him not being man enough for her a little bit on some level.
Mm-hmm. Certainly not being into her enough, which is something that she articulates herself when they meet for their anniversary dinner, and she's just been hit on by this other man at the bar. Lainey?
Yeah, so I disagree. Well, I think like they make it kind of clear from the beginning. Like I'm pretty sure the very first scene, or no, because that's when they're younger, but I think there's even another guy like at the club that they're in the first scene that's like looking at her, and they make a note, like they make several notes throughout the episode of like guys hitting on her and her kind of like enjoying like that attention, I definitely think they like show that on the episode. So I think the ending is really like, I think in the sense of this episode, it's kind of like a happy ending because like they get to continue their relationship and have that honesty where they like both understand each other a little bit better, and they get to I agree that it's like about monogamy. The only like character in the episode where I think might have like had a loss or something is, I don't remember his name, but the single guy. So I think yeah, I definitely think I don't think it was like about that. Also, I think this episode is interesting because it takes place in like a dystopian world that's like not the world that we live in now. So I think we also have to take that into consideration of how like not like none of us have ever been in a video game like as a real person, and I think like part of the episode is showing that that's like a whole separate feeling that like we don't understand yet. And that like would be something that is like totally different from what you experience like in real life. Maybe I like kind of read it like that, and like thought a lot about like the dystopian and like you know, like new technological world that they're in. It's also like important to take into consideration.
Yes, absolutely. You're absolutely right. And it's important that we sort of grapple and wrestle with the game itself and with the environment that's created by the game and with the ways in which this specific piece of technology facilitates a specific kind of coming together of these two men. But I'm really struck by your characterization of this as both a futurist and at the same time a dystopian text. Did anyone else walk away from this reading thinking, oh, well, it's far removed from where we are right now. It's set in a future time and it's a dystopian world? Lainey?
Yeah, I didn't mean like it's dystopian as it's like completely different and like everything's different. Obviously, it's like a lot of the point of the episode is to show that like things are still really similar. It's just like a few technological things that are different. But I like kind of take, maybe this is just the way I read Black Mirror, and like every episode and like anything that I watch that's like kind of like taking place in the future, like that something's different, I kind of take it as like it's a like world that's not our world but like is another version of it. So it's like hard for me to like understand it as like the same thing because it's like supposed to be, I don't know, that's just kind of how I read it, but I understand that it's like really pretty much everything in the episode is really similar to like how we live besides the technological stuff.
Yeah, if this had been 2 semesters ago, or was it 3 semesters ago, the entire class was on science fiction. So the entire class was just science fiction texts and what you're talking about there is what science fiction does as a genre. So science fiction works on these 2 poles, these 2 storytelling dynamics. The first is extrapolation and the second is defamiliarization. And what you're talking about, what you've sort of beautifully identified is, yes, this is a future world, but it's not that different from the world that we currently live in, with the exception of this VR technology that we don't have yet. And that's exactly what extrapolation does. So you extrapolate you project into the future, the current worlds and the current dynamics that you're trying to explore, in this case, same-sex sexuality, or the spectrum thereof between Black men. And you use what's called the novum, which is the tool, the technology, the thing that makes the text science fiction, as a way to sneak that in, as a way to have that discussion. And in many ways, this Black Mirror and this episode conforms beautifully to that textbook definition of science fiction. And what you end up with is a defamiliarization of same-sex sexuality. So you defamiliarize it. In this case, you make it less familiar, less quote unquote real, by having these avatars, by having these skins. So it is exactly in that sense doing what science fiction has so powerfully done since the emergence of that genre. Students that semester thought there was too much science fiction, so I have not repeated that format. But as someone who's a big fan of science fiction, clearly Black Mirror is very much working in that mold. Spruce?
Yeah, just kind of adding on to that, I feel like the sort of muted, disfamiliar, futuristic aspect of this episode sort of shows and highlights like the oppressive force of following a script that you don't necessarily like align with. And in this case, it's the script of heteronormativity and like the kinship system. And so I think that like moments when he puts the knife into the dishwasher and then it talks back at him, like, and also sort of the very structured, almost robotic moments of needing to have sex so that they can get pregnant are all a part of that sort of scripted, oppressive, like structuring of like not being able to fulfill happiness or like actual desire.
Yes, absolutely. And I love your use of the term script there, because that robotic quality, the rehearsed quality of all of these actions, and the fact that they need to be repeated constantly and repeated at specific times in specific ways, bringing in that notion of a script, which has those cues on how to perform built into them, I think is a very powerful way and productive way of approaching Black Mirror's representation of heterosexuality as something that is not organic, something that is not natural, even though we often think of heterosexuality as a natural state and any type of non-heterosexual identity or sexual practice as deviant or aberrant. In fact, heterosexuality itself is deeply institutionalized and requires a set of practices and performances that need to be carried out in very specific ways. And I think the show does a good job of showing that those are burdensome and quite trite, especially if performed in the same way over time. And that's where the moving forward in time helps a great deal. The shock of seeing Danny after we first meet him, and Theo as well, as sort of a vital couple at the club, and then the effect of seeing them in their suburban home with the birthday party, each their sets of tasks. It's a little bit depressing. Will, and then we will move on again.
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to address the use of the term dystopia. I feel like I feel like this episode was probably the least dystopian of Black Mirror's like anthology of dystopia. I feel like all the things that we're saying, like the monotony of heterosexuality, or like the confinement of the nuclear family, or like the confining nature of the nuclear family, like that's just a reflection of our modern times. The only, like, I feel like that this episode, if you took away like the VR avatars, it could literally just be a standalone piece that has nothing to do with like Black Mirror's, you know, commentary on like the future and human obsession. Like Nosedive, like that episode, literally that's a dystopia. You know, it's a world where, you know, you think it's pleasurable and you think everything is perfect, but it's inherently unequal and oppressive. Whereas here, I feel like these are just structures from now. So like, I feel like to call this piece dystopian is to call our society dystopian to a certain extent.
Mm-hmm. And if there was ever a time to call our society dystopian, it would be right now. Lainey, did you have something you wanted to add to
yeah, I was just gonna say that I said dystopian like because I was like kind of didn't know what else to say, but I meant like future science, like that's what I meant. I like I don't even like I don't know. But also like I do think it is like worth taking note that like they are having sex on a video game and like we can't do that. So like that's so like I think I do think it's important to like understand like the episode as an episode that's imitating structures that we live in our world, but at the same time it's bringing this like science fiction technological aspect that changes the world that they live in, so it is different from the world that we live in. Like I just think that's important to like take note of.
Yes, it is absolutely important to take note of. And I think you can even argue quite productively and convincingly that this is a dystopian text and that there are elements of it that are clearly dystopian. Again, when I joked just now that we live in a dystopian present, I mean, there are many people who would agree. So I certainly don't want to sort of find fault with your use of the word your use of the word dystopian. It's just that this specific text, in my reading at least, feels fairly representative of the world that we live in now. But you are quite right to point out the crucial importance of this video game and this VR technology, which we'll talk about a little bit more, because I would argue that that is the glass closet that we need to be examining, that the text gives us a representation of the glass closet that is this world. It is the game. Striking Viper is the title of the episode. That's the glass closet. That's the space that's created where these men get to come together and interact in a different way. And whether we call that interaction sex, whether we call that interaction intimacy, what kind of sex we call that interaction, that we will be discussing a little bit more. Lainey?
I also just wanted to ask if like anyone else had the same like reaction as me when they are talking and sorry, I like don't remember the characters' names, but not Danny, the other one, is like, oh, like it feels so different, like you don't understand, like, and he's kind of like seems like really manic and like really passionate about it, and I thought that he was gonna like go crazy, and he's like, you feel it in here, and he's like talking about where you put the chip in your head, and I thought he was gonna like have this crazy like addiction to like being in the female body and that like he was gonna go insane. I kind of thought that's where the episode was gonna go, and I don't know if anyone else like thought that too, or if I was the only one who read it like that, but I'm curious.
Yes, Lainey, that is such a crucial point, because we can tie this in with Snorton's analysis of the DL. Talk to me a little bit more, because I agree 100%. I believe that the text gives us addiction as the way to understand these men's relationship to the technology. And if the technology is a stand-in of the closet, of this glass closet, then this gives us a way in which the text understands living on the DL as a potentially harmful experience. How can we tie that to Snorton's analysis of the DL and dominant ways in which the DL is understood? Marcel?
Yeah, I actually completely agree with Lainey about how that part kind of seems like he's going crazy. Also, during the time that they spend apart, they do I forgot the word for it, when they flash back and forth between scenes, and he also seems like he's going crazy, like without Danny, like he screams and like hits stuff and like constantly drinking. And I think that's why it's important to take into consideration the technology that's present here, because if this was happening in our society today, let's just say like these two men had the same relationship, they don't have the outlet of having sex with one another through a video game. Like they have to just ignore their feelings or like repress them and just not admit to it. So this makes it so then it's like I found it very replicable like to drugs, this whole like having sex on video games, like you need it and you want to come back to it. So it's like if I was continuing that analogy, it's like you want to try a drug, like in today's like in our world, you want to try a drug, but you just never touch it and you leave it alone. But then if you synthetically try a drug, like on video games, sorry if this analogy is getting confusing, then you know what it feels like and you have like a taste of it and you want to continue it. So that's why I think it's so important to take into consideration the technology.
Yes, absolutely. And the game itself and the function of the game, specifically now, how can we extend or map this onto Snorton's analysis of the DL, because there's a clear link between the two. Will?
Sorry, I wasn't gonna connect it to Horton. I was gonna connect it to the piece from Brokeback Mountain.
Go ahead.
Just because when Marcel used the word addiction, it kind of made me think about the whole idea of the helpless homosexual, I think was the term or something like that, where it was like the two men, Ennis and Jack, were like, oh, we're helpless to this thing that controls us. And I think that in the sense, like the mechanism of addiction, the mechanism of the video game is that it robs both characters of agency and kind of removes, and it kind of helps blur the lines between, or like, are they gay, are they straight, and it kind of helps to kind of obscure that. And at least in this context versus Brokeback Mountain, I think it serves a more positive end here.
Yes, think
because like it
mm-hmm.
Sorry.
No, go ahead.
Because just because it makes their identities much more dynamic and complicated.
Exactly. Think of the most, arguably, I would say the most enduring line from Brokeback Mountain is, I can't quit you, right? It's when Jack says, I can't quit you. When do we use that? We use that when we talk about addiction, right? Oh, I cannot quit cigarettes. I'm trying to quit cigarettes. Quitting is hard. There is this powerful metaphor of addiction that runs through popular understandings of sexuality. And specifically when it comes to the DL and dominant representations of the DL. Is there anyone who can connect it sort of to specifically the origins of the DL, where the DL comes from, how it's been broadly understood, that ties in with this notion of addiction? Zoe, you can answer this question, or just say whatever you were hoping to contribute.
I'm hoping it kind of connects to what you were asking for. What kind of stood out to me in the reading was near the end of the reading, she talked about representations of the DL and of HIV positive men, and like this concept of the moral panic.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought that kind of, or the way the author phrased it was kind of related with me to this idea of addiction, because like the more they play, the more addicting it gets, the more they're like drawn to it. Like he literally can't sleep without playing.
Mm-hmm.
And a quote from the reading on page 28 was, this can be generally more understood as a production of moral panic, which dredges up feelings of fear and shame as they reveal real or potential social disorder.
Mm-hmm.
Which it says later can potentially disrupt public forms of deviance, or manage potentially disruptive public forms of deviance. So I feel like this addiction is kind of dangerous in the sense that it starts making things uncontrollable, and it starts making these feelings of like feelings of fear, as in like they're scared for people to find out, become sort of like toxic and like all encompassing. I don't know how to perfectly word it, but like that's what I kind of found interesting.
No, you've worded it quite perfectly, Zoe, and you're exactly right. We see the emergence of the DL and the ways in which the DL is broadly and commonly understood. We have to place it against the backdrop of HIV/AIDS. We have to see it as a public health risk. And that is what Snorton analyzes as one of the most powerful strands in representations and broad understandings of the DL, that this is a contagion, that this is something that spreads like HIV does, and that this is something that causes a moral panic. Why? Because ostensibly, purportedly, it leads to the destruction of society. It leads to the destruction of the family. And that is the way in which being on the DL has been understood, as a way in which the coherence of the family itself is under threat. So one of the most powerful ways of understanding the DL, namely as a pathology, as a contagion, as something that spreads, is exactly what the show, I would argue, does as well. It follows the parameters of mediated representations of the DL that Snorton analyzes, because we have an addiction. We also have something that spreads, right? Remember, it's Carl, who's experienced the game before, who gives the game to Danny, therefore causing it to spread from him to to someone else. And then everything you just argued, the fact that he can't sleep without doing it, the fact that he can no longer wants to have sex with his wife, and Carl can no longer perform, he's not quote unquote going to get there with the girl that he's dating, would be another indictment of this technology. So it follows that blueprint for representations of the DL by pathologizing them and by pathologizing these men who are on the DL. So that's a pretty telling way in which the text Striking Vipers conforms to the analysis that Snorton lays out. The question is if it performs fully, or if there are ways in which it potentially subverts or disrupts those dominant representations of the DL. And then we don't have to talk about this one because this, of course, is one that we will be talking about for the next 45 minutes, the ways in which Black Mirror Striking Vipers directly addresses and gives us representations, a representation rather of the down low, and as a text is one of those down low narratives, like the Oprah Winfrey Show episode and episodes where Snorton begins his analysis to the Salt and Pepper song, to the R. Kelly song, and then to the Law and Order SVU episode. So Snorton uses these pop cultural narratives, and in many ways we can place Striking Vipers as a continuation of those same narratives. The last thing that I would like for us to do, oh, and I didn't include it, but that's fine. We can transition to the reading and then circle back. So we've been talking about this concept of the down low or the DL. How does Snorton define that concept? And why does he alternately refer to it as polysemous, contradictory, or illegible in its configuration of sexuality and race? So what exactly do we mean by the DL? How does Snorton understand it? I'm not seeing any hands. Maybe the question is phrased in a more complicated way than I intended. How does Snorton define being on the DL? What does it mean? What does it include? How does it manifest itself? What are some of its characteristics and practices? If you'd like, you can turn to page 3 for one of those definitions of the DL. Yes, Will.
In terms of practices, he spends a lot of time going over gaze theory and how it like applies to like cruising while on the DL. He just like references kind of like going to popular spots and like the art of holding the stare for a little too long as like a is discursive the right way? As a discrete way of soliciting sex.
Yes, absolutely. So that would be one of the initiating mechanisms. Spruce?
Just as a definition, he says the down low links Black sexuality with duplicity, and it stands in for a bunch of different things: a group, a sexual practice, a location for that practice, a discursive concept, and a mass mediatized spectacle.
Yes, that's a beautiful definition of the DL, and it's a broad definition that tells us that as cultural critics, we should be mindful not just of the acts that are performed, not just of the actors, but also of the spaces and places in which these actions take place, and then of the narratives themselves in which these actions are embedded. And one of those characteristics is the linking or the use of duplicity. What do we mean by duplicity? Why is the down low synonymous with duplicity, with duplicitous acts? I love that word, duplicity. Marcel.
I think it's because it requires the person to live a double life, one where they're like expressing their sexuality freely, and then they go back to their heteronormative relationship where they have to play this quote unquote masculine role as assigned to them by society. So that's where like the duplicity comes. It's like they're living a double life.
Yes, yes, that's exactly right. And that's beautifully put. Why is it a contradictory phenomenon? Why does it seem to be internally contradictory, being on the down low? Will?
I mean, just like superficially, it's engaging in same-sex relationships while denying that it has like an influence on your identity. Or like, like again, the concept of the glass closet, like, or I think he says like you're not in it, you're behind the glass closet or something like that. But just the idea that like people try to that people on the DL try to separate these spheres, and it's like it's inherently at odds with itself.
Yes, and I love that you're pointing out the fact that we are talking here, or Snorton builds on this notion of the public-private sphere, which is a dichotomy and a structural dichotomy, specifically when it comes to gendered expectations, gendered behaviors that we've talked about before. And this phenomenon is both public and private at the same time. It is both public and private. So it violates that boundary between public and private that is supposed to be kept in place. If it's shrouded in duplicity and secrecy, because that's another crucial characteristic, then it's not like any normal secret. Snorton argues that it's a public secret. And that in and of itself is another contradiction, right? How can a secret be public? It would seem to speak against itself or denude itself of its secrecy if the secret is somehow publicly known. Yet it is. So this is another instance in which being on the DL doesn't conform to these binary oppositions. But we haven't talked yet about the most powerful binary opposition that is at work here. And it is that opposition that, according to Snorton, makes being on the DL, in other words, the coupling of Black masculinity on the one hand and non-heterosexual sexual activity on the other hand, as an illegible configuration. What does he mean by this? Why is it illegible? And to give you a little bit of a clue, in the article, Snorton talks about the ways in which, if you look at the Black community on the one hand, and you look at the gay community on the other hand, the men who are on the DL do not fit into either of those communities. They fall in between those communities. And it has something to do with the intersection, again, of Black masculinity and of queerness or non-heterosexual sex on the other hand. Why is that coupling illegible? Why can that coupling not be? Why does it not give men on the DL access to either the Black community or the gay community? Claudia.
Well, this kind of like introduces like the idea of dual consciousness, and that you can operate within two separate spheres while not necessarily fitting into both of them. Like it, I'm just kind of the idea that like you can't exist as a Black man and as a gay man, but not both of them at the same time. And you can operate within those two spheres, but the contrasting identities don't work together, especially because of the way that either homosexuality or Blackness is like treated in the world. So it's kind of just like these two separate spheres that can never really overlay.
Yes, that's exactly right. And that's, I think you've outlined the impossibility. And again, we're not talking about the impossibility of being on the DL being on the DL itself. We're talking about the impossibility of being represented as such and of finding a home in any type of cultural community. Marcel?
So I'm taking an intro to gender and sexuality class right now. So I'm not sure if we discussed it in this class or if I discussed it in that class about Black men being known for their hyper masculinity, like stereotypically. And I think that's why it contradicts homosexuality against stereotypically is known to be like a man who aligns more with like feminine stereotypes. So then when you're contrasting that with the hyper masculinity that is assigned to Black men, it like doesn't really work together. Like they completely contradict one another. And I know it was in this class. I can't remember like the Black. I know we talked about Edmund Till and how he his gaze itself was violating of the white woman. So like there's this like predatory, I guess, notion of Black men against white women. So that goes that goes against it by like saying no, he's homosexual and he's actually attracted to other men.
Yes, you're exactly right. So Snorton argues that in many ways, the DL reveals something about already existing configurations of Blackness, and then specifically Black masculinity. So it becomes an extension of the ways in which the culture writ large, and white culture specifically, already invests in Black masculinity a sense of deviance, a sense of aberrance, and a sense of sort of a hyperpotentiality or an excess, something that is too much. That already exists. So if you couple that then with queerness, you're building one set of cultural assumptions and toxic stereotypes on top of another. And that makes the sign so complex. That makes this double sign, this compound sign, so ambivalent. Whereas, so in the dominant understanding, there can be no queerness in the Black community. So that's one dominant understanding. And on the other hand, there can be no escaping one's Blackness in the white community, because that axis of identity cannot be rendered invisible. It is always visible, and in a white supremacist society, it isn't just visible, it's hyper visible. So it's overburdened with meanings and representations. And that makes the sign so impossible, that makes it illegible, because we can only read it from within a lens that has already been determined, and some would argue overdetermined, Snorton would argue overdetermined, by investments in whiteness, by investments in Blackness, and by investments in Black masculinity, already in and of itself an intersection of two different axes. So now you're adding a third to it, and the sign itself becomes unstable as a result. And he returns again and again to the instability of being on the DL because of the various layers of complexity. So what are some of the assumptions or connotations that are usually associated with being on the DL? And this is where Snorton uses the Oprah Winfrey Show and those episodes in which she shone a light on being on the DL as an illustration of it. What are some of those assumptions? Will?
He says that like people assume that it's like a liminal transitionary phase, that like when you're on the DL, you're really just waiting to come out. And I think the person that Oprah Winfrey used to like illustrate the DL did come out and is now living as a gay man now, which kind of reinforced that transition narrative, or like that, you know, I'm lost just waiting for the right time story.
Yes, and that is a crucial point. So the DL was represented as a transitional state. In other words, something that, yes, can be ambivalent, but its ambivalence is ultimately resolved, and we are given an out person at the end. We've talked about this. We've talked about politics of liberation, right? Coming out was one of those key tenets, key pillars of a politics of liberation. Coming out and then pride in one's newfound identity. How does Striking Vipers come down on this? Does striking vipers represent the DL as a liminal or a transitional state? Does it enforce a coming out, the emergence of an out gay subject? Does it follow along in that popular blueprint for DL narratives? Emma?
I don't necessarily think so, because at the end we see that they're still kind of living in, if you want to call the down low like a liminal phase, they're kind of still living in that liminality, and they never really transition to another route, because they go into the game once a year. They never definitively decide if they're gay or straight or whatnot. So I think that it striking vipers rather doesn't really reinforce that coming out narrative so much.
Mm-hmm. Yes, yes. I think you make a powerful claim for that. Lainey? I'm not sure if Lainey had anything that she wanted to add. Why, according to Snorton, why do existing classifications like gay, bisexual, or queer, why are they an ill fit for these men on the DL specifically? Why do we have the DL instead of those other classifications, those other terms? Snorton talks about this when he critiques queer theory writ large and the emergence of the closet as a central metaphor in queer theory, but he expands it to include a critique of queer theory itself and the ways in which these terms are configured, terms like gay, queer, bisexual. They're coded white. So Snorton argues that those terms are invested with whiteness. They have white subjects in mind. So terms like gay, queer, bisexual presuppose a white subject, which makes them an ill fit. Specifically, Snorton talks about the fact that gay doesn't just presuppose a white male subject, it presupposes a white male effeminate subject, which would represent an additional challenge or potential challenge. Will?
Yeah, I just kind of wanted to respond to his point there. I think he's kind of in critiquing notions of, the terminology gay, bisexual as gay being an inherently effeminate white man. I think more or less a comment. I think he's just as guilty as going back to the Widow's reading, which is about intersectionality and kind of essentializing identities. I think that was just his kind of way of generalizing with a broad brush the term gay. I didn't entirely I agree that it is coded white to a certain extent, but I disagree with him kind of doubling down on this idea that there is a what is the term, hegemony performance of white male gayness.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, of course, Snorton isn't just talking about, although this is an argument that he makes, he isn't just talking about sort of the effeminate quality or that specific characteristic. What he's really talking about is that when we're thinking of gay, when we're thinking of gay culture, when we're thinking of the gay community, then those are places and spaces that are not designed for Black people. They're designed for white people. And they actively seek to police the boundary between white subjects and non-white subjects. And this is certainly true. I mean, if you read any history of the gay liberation movement, then, and this is true for the second wave feminist movement, then these are movements that were white, and they were not white arbitrarily, they were white by choice and they were white by design, and they actively enforced policies where people of color were not welcomed into the ranks of leadership or were potentially seen as problems that would detract from the central goals that these movements were trying to achieve. So the problem is structural. The problem is that these spaces, these communities, these forms of activism were steeped in whiteness and actively excluded people of color. So there's a long legacy of these terms being synonymous with whiteness and with an exertion of white power. So that's what he's talking about there specifically. In many ways, what I love about Snorton is that he doesn't just give us one thesis statement, he goes back to that thesis statement and complicates it over time. So we have here the first thesis statement, and it comes early in the article. It comes on page 3. In many ways, this is a perfectly adequate preliminary thesis statement for his analysis of the DL. So I'm going to read it out loud, and I want you to unpack it for me, and in so doing, define the terms that I've highlighted here in bold. So the DL's emergence in the early 21st century reflects a series of logics that naturalize the equation of blackness with sexual duplicity, even as it manufactures an increasing demand for materials that facilitate the disciplining and surveillance of Black bodies. What is Snorton saying here? We've already talked about sexual duplicity. We've already defined that term as a key characteristic of being on the DL. What does it mean to naturalize the equation of Blackness with sexual duplicity? I've used that term probably 77 times this semester. Naturalize, or I've used its opposite, denaturalize. Will?
What he's saying here is that like social dynamics of the 21st century made it so that sexual duplicity was like inherent to Blackness, and that at the same time it was that connection also speaks to like larger mechanisms at that time that demanded again for like punishing and monitoring Black people and controlling them. I guess like a lot of the idea of like the war on drugs and all these like horrible policies that unfairly targeted and were designed to kind of systemically oppress Black men.
Yes, and that in many ways is a perfect segue to the second clause, namely that the DL and how the DL is broadly understood is wrapped up in dynamics of disciplining and surveilling Black bodies. And using the war on drugs is a great example. Snorton uses the HIV/AIDS epidemic and the governmental response or lack of a response to that epidemic. And then when the response was there, it was a response that was very much exclusionary. Snorton points out that in many ways, the CDC and other governmental actors routinely papered over, the press as well, or paid no attention to the fact that there were complexities and nuances that were never captured in official governmental reports on the HIV/AIDS crisis, or were warped as a result. This surveillance of Black bodies, what role does that play specifically in the DL phenomenon? And are there ways in which Striking Vipers engages with this as well, gives us examples of this? This constant attempt on the part of the government to surveil and discipline Black bodies. Okay. We'll move on, but there are a number of instances in which that is the case and is represented in Striking Vipers, but we'll move on. So Snorton Snorton, follows this first analysis with an introduction of the central metaphor that will really come to stand in and will really come to embody the unique conditions and the unique lived reality of being on the DL. And that is this notion of the glass closet. That is key to us to understanding his reconfiguration and reconceptualization of this sign, of being on the DL rather, by using this sign. What does he mean by the glass closet? So a good test, you should have walked away from this reading with an understanding of the glass closet, because that is really the central and the centralizing sign or metaphor that Snorton uses to reinterpret what it means to be on the DL. What does he mean by the glass closet? What is the glass closet? What does it do? What does it capture? Romy.
This is just a partial definition of it, considering that there are multiple aspects to it, but a small part was how the closet is conceived of, especially in white terms, as being a place where you're hiding before you come out, where you're invisible to the world. But the glass closet talks about that surveillance of Black bodies, on how even in this place where they're supposed to be hidden and confined within the norms of society because they haven't, quote, came out yet, they're still being watched and observed and oppressed.
Yes, by virtue of what? In other words, owing to what? Why does the regular closet, in other words, why does the metaphor that we associate with this pre-coming out phase, aka being in the closet or being closeted, why does that metaphor not work for Black people, specifically here in this case for Black men? Where does that metaphor fall short? What does it not provide them, and why does it not provide them those layers of quote unquote protection or safety that white people would find in the closet? Caroline, I think you had your hand up.
Well, I was just going to say that we've kind of touched on this earlier in the class, but that queer Black men do not fit into the communities of the Black men or the queer population. And, you know, Black sexuality is often seen to be viewed in this glass closet rather than like the normal, like white closeted view that we as a white spectator, you know, you usually associate with queer people who have not expressed their queerness to the public. But like Black men are all the time like are subjected to like hypervisibility and like speculation over their own masculinity and their own identity since the beginning of time. I mean, since slavery, since the oppression of the Black man came into being, and so they're not really given that type of privilege of the ability to be closeted because they have constantly been under this speculation, under this visibility for the entirety of that time.
Yes, that's exactly right. So in standard understandings of the closet is supposed to give people who are not out yet a defense against identification as gay, queer, bisexual, and in turn, a defense against possible criminalization and punishment. That's supposed to be the draw of the closet, right? The closet is supposed to be a safe space. It's supposed to be a space that insulates you against the outside world. It also restricts you. In other words, the sense of confinement is also part of the closet. You have limited mobility, you have limited agency, you have to act on your desires in private, but it also does give you a sense of protection. And crucially, that protection is coded as darkness. So in traditional white interpretations and queer theory of the closet, darkness, the quality of receding into Blackness, in other words, of no longer being visible, is precisely that which allows white, gay, queer, bisexual subjects to gain access to safety. In other words, they're no longer visible as queer people because they recede into darkness. And that darkness or blackness of the closet does not provide concealment or let alone safety or protection for Black people, because their Blackness is always already seen. It is always already on display. As Caroline said, it's hyper visible, and they are always and already punished for it. They are always and already subject to surveillance, control, disciplining, punishment. So that's the way in which the closet doesn't work. And that's why Snorton replaces it with this notion of the glass closet. Now, why the glass closet? And Snorton talks at length and quite beautifully and poetically and evocatively about glass and all of the ways in which glass as, as an animate object beautifully captures sort of the contradictions and the ambivalences of being on the DL. Talk to me about glass and why Snorton seizes on glass as a way to rebuild the closet. What is it about glass? Will?
Well, I think like specifically the use of the terminology glass closet, not only building off the analysis that it's about, that it doesn't offer the same protection to Black queer men that it would to white queer men. I think that the idea of the glass is that like this whole concept of the DL is like a known social phenomenon. It's from what the reading made it sound like, it's a pretty, not systemic, but like widespread known thing that happens. So it's like, yes, it's discrete, but also, yes, we acknowledge that it happened.
Yes, exactly. So discretion, that's another characteristic that we didn't talk about yet. That's also crucial to the DL writ large. So these acts have to be performed discreetly, but because this closet, again, the closet would be the space in which those actions would be performed. Because this is a glass closet, there is always the risk of surveillance and hypervisibility. Catherine?
Kind of jumping off that point, Will's point, Snorton also talks about how glass is everywhere and it's often not really recognized as being everywhere, but that because of its nature, like being clear, it also kind of offers that hypervisibility while also being unnoticed or unrecognized, which kind of goes into the contradictory nature.
Yes, you've put that beautifully, Catherine. So glass in many ways sort of reveals Snorton's interest in the politics of visually identifying difference. We know this, right? We use the mirror and the mirror stage, Lacan's mirror stage, as a way in which we began to understand the ways in which psychoanalysis provided feminist theory with an understanding of sexual difference. The mirror is glass, right? The fact that the mirror can call on the power of glass to reflect, to make visible, to allow the user of the mirror to see is key to Snorton's use of glass. So on the one hand, glass reveals his interest in a politics of visually identifying difference. On the other, as Catherine just said, glass is part of our everyday lives. So we take it for granted. It's everywhere. It's deeply embedded in material culture. But also, glass, according to Snorton, defies classification. Glass is strange. Is it a solid? Is it a liquid? It's very strong on the one hand, but it's brittle on the other hand. So it's contradictory. And it's that same contradiction that underlies his analysis of being on the DL. And then lastly, Snorton talks about the DL or views the DL through representations of being on the DL, right? So he's interested in mediated representations of being on the down low. That's why he starts with Oprah, does the Salt and Pepper song, talks about Law and Order SVU. So he's interested in representation. why is glass as a subject or glass as a tool or as an element so intimately bound up with representation and with mediated representation? Romy?
Because glass is a reflective object, it's going to show you back an image of yourself, but at the same time, or an image of someone, but at the same time, it's kind of distorting. You can think of like a funhouse mirror or like any normal mirror kind of alters the vision that you see. It's not a direct capture of reality. It's at least a somewhat changed version.
Yes, that's exactly right. So it's intimately bound up with representation. And then, crucially, it becomes the way in which we access those mediated representations, right? What is our television made of? Glass. What is our phone made of? Glass, or at least partly. So glass in and of itself has always been synonymous with representation and now becomes the tool of that representation as well. And that is the case in Striking Vipers 2. Talk to me about the ways in which Striking Vipers, the game, the experience, the environment, acts as a glass closet, or doesn't. Marcel.
Well, you could think of like the TV screen kind of being their glass closet that they hide behind, but like it goes back to like the transparency of glass. Like there's only so much that they can hide. Also, like even though this isn't glass, I did see like there was a large presence of mirrors throughout the episode. Like in the very beginning when it's like almost like the mirror reflected relationships. Because there needed to be some sort of reflection or proof of the relationship. So like in the beginning, like the mirror reflected the sex scene between Theo and Danny. And then after the first time I think they had sex on the video game, Carl looks into the mirror and just is like staring at his reflection. And it almost looks like he's like enclosed by the mirror.
Yes, that's exactly right. And we have many scenes in which we see Danny peering through glass, through windows, at scenes on display in the outside world. You're exactly right. How does the glass closet of playing the game, so in other words, if playing the game acts as a glass closet, which means that these men remain visible by virtue of their blackness. So this is how Snorton constructs this glass closet. We as viewers, we as spectators, when we watch the show, we get to see these men in this glass closet, and we do see them in the glass closet. The episode constantly shifts back and forth between the game and the avatars and these men as they're playing the game. How do we see them? What is the effect of playing the game on the player? So simply talk to me about what they look like. Are they standing up? Are they active during the experience? Zoe?
They kind of well, they're motionless when they're on the couch, and their like eyes roll back, and they're kind of, it's as if they're in this like euphoric other like higher world that's like just takes their soul out of their body and puts it in this game. So like basically whoever is there sitting on that couch is kind of like bodiless, motionless, like there's not really anything. It's like as if there's nothing really existing in them, and like everything is being poured into that game when they're playing it.
Zoe, that is absolutely beautifully or harrowingly or horrifically put, depending on your representation. But you're absolutely right? In your reading, like it's as if their soul has left their bodies. It's as if they're drained of any type of vitality. If the show uses the experience of playing the game as a representation of the DL, and I think we can all agree that that's the case, right? If we have a down-low narrative, then the down-low narrative takes place in the game, primarily. If that is the representation of it, what does this mean about Striking Vipers' representation of being on the DL? What does it mean for the show to make that choice of presenting these men as lifeless, drained of any energy? You could argue that they look like zombies, their eyes wide out. What is the show doing by giving us that representation of that experience of being in the glass closet and of accessing a space that becomes the space of their down low experiences? Eliza?
I feel like it kind of shows how they can only have this sort of like idea in their heads, and it's not really like physical until Carl kind of like forces it to become more physical. Like it's always they're looking at their screen, they're never like, they don't see each other from the birthday party throughout the entire affair until Theo invites him over for dinner, and that makes Danny really uncomfortable because he's like, now I actually, then it's not just in their heads and it's not just behind a screen, and it's kind of like they have to actually come to terms and like face each other for the first time after just having this entire relationship behind all this glass, basically.
Yes.
And behind this glass, yeah.
Yeah, that's a crucial point, right? So as a down-low narrative, which is how we're choosing to interpret Striking Vipers, the show, Black Mirror, is giving us a visual representation of being on the down low. And this visuality of identity is exactly what Snorton is interested in. It's one of his key, I would say, implicit premises, that identity comes to us through visuality, through visual representation. That's where we started our class, right? That is, I would argue, sort of the key cornerstone of our entire class, that identity is visually communicated, visually constructed, comes through us through visual representations. The media plays a huge role in this. So if that's the case, then the show gives us representations of the player while they're playing the game. And we've talked about that as lifeless, zombies. So I'm going to fill in the blank here. Not particularly desirable, right? Not particularly pleasant looking. It gives us the game as a space in which that narrative takes hold. And then it gives us that crucial scene in the rain. So these are three representations of being on the DL. Analyze them for me in terms of how you, as a spectator, unpack the ways in which those representations of the DL are coded on the screen. So you can talk either about the rain scene or about the game and the game scenes. Spruce?
I thought the rain scene was really interesting because they have this moment and then you see the police, they're fighting, and you see the police car roll up. And I think that was sort of like representation. Even if they're escaping to the down low, they're trapped in their bodies, they're trapped in their blackness, and no matter how they are or like what their sexuality is or how they feel, because of their blackness, they're exteriorly represented in a way, and they're trapped in their stereotype. They're like fixed, and so they can never actually like escape into down low. Yeah, I don't know if that makes sense.
Yes,
but,
Spruce, yeah. It makes perfect sense. Yes, I think that's a very, very convincing reading, right? You could argue that the actual down low, so the quote unquote real experience of being on the down low, which only happens in that scene. Again, if we believe in this, if we separate the real from the story world that exists in the game, and you could argue whether that's just as real or differently real from the rain scene. But if that is the only time in which these men really act on it, then that becomes a really important scene to unpack. Tarek?
This scene is very interesting because at first I felt like it would be something you'd seen like a rom-com of like two people coming together, meeting in the rain, and then they like kiss, and that's supposed to be like this big, beautiful, romantic moment. But because specifically these two are, because they're male, because they're black, and the connotations that have of them not like being able to show proper affection in a physically intimate way that we're used to seeing, then we get like this catharsis through them like fighting, and for me at least, this fighting was code for like them having sex. And they were doing this like in the rain in this setting. It's like typically it's supposed to be romantic, but here it's not. It's like very aggressive and like very violent, and it's like the only way we're allowed to see this kind of like intimate moment between two black men.
Yes, I think you're exactly right. I have a follow-up question for you, Tarek. In the game, where they do end up acting on their desire and there is a sexual interaction, that is initiated by violence as well, right? It's a fighting game. So they begin by fighting each other, and that fighting is replicated in the rain scene. Do you believe that if the police had not shown up, that fight would have segged into sex the same way that it did in the game? In other words, did the violence need to be a cover for their masculinity, to keep their masculinity intact and the stereotypes that accrue to that masculinity, so that it can be used as a cover for an eventual sexual act?
I feel like it would, because I felt when I was watching the scene, like the fighting style, it was very much pushing and shoveling and grappling and almost wrestling. And all like the different fighting styles, like wrestling is one of the most intimate form of fighting styles, as opposed to like straight boxing where it's like a jab, a punch. Like wrestling, you're grappling, like your arms are like going around other people, your body's being contorted into different positions and they're constantly rolling around. So I felt like it definitely had those undertones.
Yeah, that was my takeaway from that scene as well, that they needed the fight, they needed the cover, the protection of the fight in the same way that they needed it in the game before they could truly act on that desire. And we've talked about the ways in which the kiss and these two different characters' responses to the kiss are complex and ambivalent in and of themselves. Before we wrap up, and I realize we only have a couple more minutes left, I do want to create a space for you to tell me whether you believe that this representation of being on the down low subverts in any way the dominant representations that Snorton unpacks in the article. So those representations, I would say with the exception of the Salt and Pepper song, where he does find some liberatory potential or progressive potential in that song and that specific verse or lyric that he analyzes, all of the other representations are reactionary representations of being on the down low. Is this one of those representations? Or does this episode meaningfully upend or at least broach or call into question some of those stereotypes that attend to dominant understandings of the DL? Will?
I think it is progressive in that it kind of does away with the whole sexual duplicity aspect of Blackness, and that at the end we find that Theo kind of is okay with this arrangement and consents to it, and doesn't, I mean, I'm sure there's an initial reaction of feeling cheated, but we don't really get to see it. We just kind of get to see, you know, in the future, the relationship stabilized in its new form. So I think it does address the kind of like the role of Black women as victims and agentless in this relationship.
Thank you. Anyone else? How does anyone else feel about the ending and where the ending leaves things? Does it create a space for that expression of Black male intimacy, Black male sexuality, being on the DL? Does it try to stabilize it? Does it leave it unstable? Does it treat it as transitional or no? Is the ending a type of containment? Does it try to contain the potential progressive, reactionary, upending characteristics of this relationship that has emerged? Marcel?
I think it does end on a containing note, just because if it wasn't contained, then he could be free to do it whenever he wants to. And the fact that it looked like a transaction, like at the end when she gives him the device and he gives her the, I think it's his the box for the wedding ring, so she can pretend like she's not married. Like it's not a satisfying end. At least I didn't think it was, because he's still only limited to be his, what I guess we can consider his happiest once a year. So in that way, I would say like he's still confined to just experiencing and expressing his like sexuality once a year for a limited amount of time.
I think you're exactly right. And I love how you point to that scene where there is a literal transaction and these two signs are exchanged, right? The ring, which is of course a very powerful sign, has a number of different signifieds, and in this case is a proxy and a stand-in for the institution of marriage, for monogamy, and the game, which becomes, as we've argued, a stand-in for the glass closet. He's given entrance to, he gets to step into that closet once a year in the same way that she gets to step out of monogamy and step out on him once a year. Caroline?
I would agree with Marcel. I did not find the ending to be particularly satisfying. And I think that at the rain scene, they had a choice with the episode of whether or not to, use that as a turning point and kind of make it more of a queer story and make it more of a satisfying ending in which you see the full development of these two men's sexuality, or they took it in the direction that they did where it's still kind of ambiguous and we're still kind of left to kind of make the ends meet in the way that we see as the spectator to be the end of the story. It kind of leaves a little bit more ambiguity.
Yes, you're exactly right. And I do think, and this works and reflects and follows Snorton's analysis, it is so telling and so meaningful that that rain scene is interrupted by the law, right? By a representation of the law with a capital L. In other words, you could argue that the show is arguing that it is a privilege for these men, for white men specifically, to get the chance to figure it out, to figure out what they're going to do. Will we act on it? Will we not act on it? And that Black men do not have that privilege. Again, because of their Blackness, because of their hypervisibility, because they don't live in the closet that white gay men can retreat to, where they are made invisible by Blackness, these men, made visible by their Blackness, don't have that privilege. So it can't be the grand romantic scene that we would see in white rom-coms, because those white subjects have nothing to fear. They can just figure it out. No consequences, no potential punishment. The show is saying that is simply not a privilege that these two men have, and it's telling that they're interrupted by the police. And then one last thing before we do actually wrap up. Snorton talks a couple of times or mentions that some of the most powerful genres that have taken up the L narratives are melodramatic, that we could call them melodramas. And of course, it wouldn't be a melodrama if we didn't have a rushed, quote unquote, happy ending. And that is, although this is not a melodrama, it does, in its ending, give us a very melodramatic ending where everything is rushed, right? We only get to spend a couple of minutes with them in this future state. and where so much, remember, dust is raised up in the process. That's what Mulvey refers to as the melodrama's storytelling dynamic. There's been this excess, something has been released, but the melodramatic text has to try to contain it, but it fails to do it, which is why the happy ending is never a true happy ending. It's made complex, it's made sour, it's made bittersweet. And I would argue that in the ending, we have a return to that basic melodramatic impulse or storytelling technique. So in that sense, the episode conforms to that as well. Okay. This was another great discussion. We didn't get to show any scenes, but again, I think that's only a testament to the fact that you all came well prepared to discuss both the text and the theory in tandem. And it also means I'm not going to have any problem with the YouTube censors when it comes to uploading this. So thank you all so much for attending today's class, and I will see you again on Monday. Bye for now.